What started as a private film screening in Beverly Hills turned into something no one could explain. When Keanu Reeves spoke about Jesus, Mel Gibson's face went pale, then the tears came. But it wasn't just emotion, it was revelation. What did Keanu say that shattered Hollywood's silence on faith and left the entire room breathless? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The golden hour light drifted through the tall, arched windows of a private Beverly Hills screening room, casting long beams across rows of deep brown leather chairs. Velvet curtains lined the walls, muffling the quiet footsteps of assistants and executives finding their seats. There was no red carpet, no flashing cameras, no press outside. Tonight was invitation only. No fanfare, no expectations. Just a room full of people used to controlling stories, now gathering to witness one that had already taken control of its creator. At the front of the room stood Mel Gibson, holding a small black microphone in both hands. He wasn't wearing his usual polished smile. There was something weathered about him, something raw. He didn't wear a suit. Instead, a simple navy blue button-down and slacks, as though dressing down was the only armor he could carry into a night like this. His eyes moved slowly across the audience, not judging, not scanning, just searching for something, maybe understanding, maybe silence, maybe the courage to begin. The crowd was small but powerful. Studio heads, A-list actors, iconic directors, people who had made the industry what it was. They sat not in straight rows, but in scattered clusters of chairs. It felt more like a living room than a premiere. That was intentional. Mel had insisted. He didn't want a red carpet event. He wanted communion. He cleared his throat once and then spoke, his voice low but steady. What you're about to see tonight, it's not a movie, not in the way we usually talk about movies. He paused, let the weight of the silence settle. This is a confession, a journey, a question I've been asking myself for 20 years, maybe longer. Some of you know pieces of that story. Tonight, I'm showing you all of it. There was no applause, just a shared breath. One of those rare moments when a room full of powerful people, collectively, chooses to set down their egos. Mel's gaze swept across the third row and stopped for just a second on a familiar face. Keanu Reeves sat quietly, dressed in black, legs crossed, hands folded gently in his lap. He wasn't hiding, but he wasn't calling attention to himself either. That was his way, always present, never loud. He nodded once, slowly, as if giving something back to Mel without saying a word. And just like that, Mel stepped away from the mic. The lights dimmed, the silence deepened, and the screen flickered to life. The screen lit up with a slow, fading white that melted into a deep black. Then a single word appeared: forgiveness. No studio logos, no flashy title sequence, just that one word hovering in silence before the story began. The first scene opened on a barren desert landscape, wind carving patterns into the sand. A solitary figure stumbled across the frame, bruised, bloodied, and broken. There were no words, just breath, just motion, just pain. The audience leaned in. For the next 90 minutes, no one looked away. The film was unlike anything Mel had made before. It followed the life of a man haunted by failure, consumed by grief, and desperate for redemption. A man who didn't pray for answers but cried out in silence. A man who didn't ask for salvation but kept walking anyway. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't safe, and it wasn't clean. It was, as Mel had warned, a confession. Keanu sat motionless. There was something in the way he watched that felt different. He wasn't absorbing it as an actor or analyzing it like a filmmaker. He was listening to it, letting the film speak to something inside him he didn't show often. maybe didn't show at all. Every frame of the film carried the weight of real sorrow. There were no tidy resolutions, no grand miracle. Just the gradual unfolding of one man's struggle to believe that grace could still find him in the middle of his wreckage. It was raw, it was intimate, and it was deeply uncomfortable in its honesty. About halfway through the film, a scene showed the main character sitting alone in a dark chapel. Rain tapped against the stained glass windows. The man whispered, "Why did you let this happen?" And the silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds. In the theater, that silence echoed. Keanu's fingers curled slightly in his lap. As the film moved toward its final act, the man meets a stranger, an unnamed figure who walks beside him without offering any clear answers. Just presence. They sit in silence. They weep together, and nothing changes, except that the man no longer feels alone. No one says the word Jesus, but the implication is there. Gentle, unmistakable. When the credits finally rolled, the screen faded again to black. One last phrase appeared. "He never left you." Then the lights slowly rose. No one moved. There wasn't even the usual shuffle of coats or the buzz of phones coming back to life. For a full minute, the room remained still. A sacred silence had settled over the space. This wasn't the end of a film. This felt like the pause after a prayer. Mel stepped slowly to the front. His eyes were red. He didn't smile. He didn't posture. He looked out at the room like a man who had just handed over his heart and wasn't sure if it would be returned. "I know that was a lot," he said quietly. "I know it wasn't what you're used to seeing in a theater." He took a deep breath, then added, "This film, it's about the possibility of redemption, even when you think you've gone too far to ever be found again." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I'd like to open the floor to anyone who has something to say about the film, about faith, about anything." A few people shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but out of hesitation. In Hollywood, vulnerability was a performance, but this invitation felt real, raw, dangerous. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they didn't want to break the fragile atmosphere that had wrapped itself around the room. Then a producer near the back cleared his throat. "I've made 22 films," he began, voice slightly hoarse. "All of them about people overcoming something, addiction, failure, grief. But what I just watched wasn't about overcoming, it was about surviving. About being seen in the middle of your worst moment and still being worthy of love." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A well-known actress followed. "There was a scene where the man just sits by the river and cries, and the stranger doesn't interrupt, doesn't try to fix him, just sits with him. I've never seen that kind of love on screen, and it made me realize maybe I've never believed in it because I've never experienced it until tonight." Another director raised a hand. "That chapel scene, the silence, it reminded me of the time I sat alone in my car after my divorce, crying out to a God I wasn't sure existed. That silence in your film, I heard that same silence that night. But I also felt that same presence. One by one, the room came alive with stories of pain, of searching, of quiet moments people had carried for years, never knowing if they were sacred or just sad. The screening room had transformed into something more than a theater. It had become a confessional, a sanctuary. Through it all, Keanu remained quiet. Nell noticed. His eyes returned again and again to the third row. Keanu's face was unreadable, but his stillness said everything. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but his presence was felt. Everyone in the room could sense it. Mel finally addressed him. "Keanu," he said, his voice more of an invitation than a prompt. "You've been quiet tonight, and I know you didn't come here to talk, but I'd really like to know what you think. About faith, about this film, about Jesus." The words fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. All eyes turned to Keanu. He didn't respond immediately. He let the silence breathe. He looked down at his hands, then slowly back up. His eyes, dark and gentle, met Mel's. What happened next would not be dramatic in tone, but it would shake the foundation of every heart in that room. He shifted slightly in his seat, the way someone does when preparing to tell the truth they've never spoken aloud. He hadn't planned to say anything, but something in that film, something in the pain and the presence it portrayed, had stirred something in him that could no longer stay hidden. He inhaled softly, and then said just one sentence. "Okay, I'll tell you what I believe." The room went completely still again, not with expectation but with reverence, because everyone there knew something sacred was about to begin. The film unfolded like a quiet confession. There were no dramatic swells of music, no CGI, no quick edits, just long, lingering shots of a man walking through the wreckage of his life. A man who had lost his family, his identity, and his faith, yet somehow kept moving forward. Not out of hope, but because sitting still hurt worse. Mel had written every scene from a place most people tried to avoid: childhood trauma, addiction, betrayal. The kind of brokenness that didn't just scar, it reshaped. And yet woven through all the despair there were threads of something else: gentle moments, small kindnesses, a stranger handing him a cup of coffee, a child reaching out a hand without understanding why. These moments were brief but unforgettable. Glimpses of grace that didn't fix anything, but made the darkness bearable for one more day. Keanu didn't shift once in his seat. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, not blinking, not reacting outwardly, but absorbing every image, every silence, every unspoken cry. He looked less like a viewer and more like someone returning to a memory. The film's central moment arrived just past the halfway mark. The protagonist, desperate, sleep-deprived, near the edge of a breakdown, wanders into a small chapel at dawn. He doesn't pray. He doesn't kneel. He just sits. The camera holds on him as light slowly pours through the stained glass windows. It's silent, utterly silent, until he speaks just one sentence. "I don't know if you're real, but if you are, please don't leave me here alone." That line didn't land like a punch. It landed like an echo, one that everyone in the room had heard before, whether in their own voice or in someone else's eyes. The man never receives an answer, no miracle, no voice from above, no vision. Instead, the next morning, a stranger sits next to him. Doesn't speak, doesn't ask, just sits, present. And in that stillness, the main character weeps for the first time. Not from pain, but from relief. Someone was with him. That was all. And somehow, it was enough. From that point forward, the film didn't resolve anything. It didn't tie up the man's story in neat emotional bows. It simply showed him beginning again, walking into the world with no answers, but with something new, the sense that maybe he wasn't alone. When the final scene faded to black, and the words, "He never left you," appeared one last time, there was no applause, no sound at all. Just breathing, just presence. Keanu lowered his head slightly, eyes closed, as if holding something sacred in place. And in the silence that followed, the real story was about to begin. The air in the screening room felt different now, as if the film had pulled something loose from beneath the surface. There was no fidgeting, no rush to speak, no one looking at their phones, just silence, the kind of silence that follows a moment of truth you didn't see coming. Mel stood near the front of the room, his shoulders slightly hunched, eyes moist but clear. He looked like a man who had just walked through fire, and was still unsure if he'd made it out alive. He waited a few seconds longer, letting the last frame of the film echo through the room. Then he took a shallow breath and stepped forward. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice hoarse, "except thank you for being here, for watching, for letting me show you a part of myself I usually keep buried." No one clapped, and that felt right. Mel wasn't looking for praise. He was looking for connection. "This story," he continued, "wasn't meant to solve anything. I didn't make it to prove a point or preach. I made it because I needed to know if anyone else had ever sat in that silence and wondered if they were still loved." He looked down for a moment, then back at the audience. "I'd like to open the floor, if anyone has something to say, about the film, about what it stirred in you, or maybe about something you've carried alone for too long." The invitation hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. For a moment, no one moved. Then a woman stood up. A casting director with decades in the industry, known more for her sharp wit than vulnerability. "I wasn't expecting this," she said, voice cracking. "I came because Mel invited me, and I figured I'd see something good, maybe even great. But I didn't expect to see myself." She paused, eyes welling. "When he cried in that chapel," she continued, "that was me. After my son died. After the funeral, I sat alone in my kitchen for hours and said the same words. Please, don't leave me here alone. I didn't tell anyone that until now." Mel bowed his head. Others in the room looked down, visibly moved. Another man spoke, a younger actor, barely in his 30s. "I've never been religious," he admitted. "Never even been inside a church. But something about that scene in the rain. When the man breaks down and the stranger just sits with him, that wrecked me. Because I realized how long I've been waiting for someone to do the same for me." Then a studio executive, a quiet man in a tailored gray suit. "I've made a living off stories with neat endings," he said slowly. "But this story didn't give us that. It gave us something harder. The truth that sometimes just being seen is the beginning of healing." One by one, the room opened. People who had spent their careers pretending to be strong began to share the moments they'd felt weakest. There was no shame in the room, no image to protect. Just people letting their guards down, some for the first time in years. And through all of it, Keanu remained still. Keanu sat quietly in the third row, his expression calm yet unreadable. He wasn't checking the clock, glancing around, or offering polite nods. He was listening, deeply, as if each person's story was a thread and he was silently weaving them together in his mind. He didn't take notes, he didn't shift his posture, he just stayed with them, moment after moment, word after word. Mel noticed. He kept glancing in Keanu's direction, not to pressure him, but almost as if drawing strength from his presence. There was something grounding about the way Keanu listened. It made the room feel safer, more honest. Someone in the front row, a veteran producer, cleared his throat and stood. "I've worked with Mel on 3 different films," he said, "and I've seen him go through hell and back. But this film isn't about Mel. It's about all of us. That moment where the man in the story realizes he's not alone, even though nothing's been fixed. I've never seen that shown with such clarity. For me, that's the closest I've ever seen cinema come to spiritual truth." He sat down, hands trembling. A few others shared as well. A screenwriter spoke about losing her father. A director admitted he had walked away from religion years ago, but tonight something stirred. It wasn't belief exactly, but something quieter. A curiosity, a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. No one tried to outshine the others. No one turned their comment into a pitch. That wasn't the mood. That wasn't the room. It wasn't Hollywood tonight. It was something else entirely. Mel stepped forward again. "I've never believed in perfect faith," he said. "Not anymore. But I believe in presence, in the sacredness of showing up, even when you have no answers. He looked toward Keanu once more, then gently spoke. And Keanu, I don't want to put you on the spot. I really don't. But I know you've carried your own share of silence. And if you feel like speaking, if not for us, then maybe for yourself, I'd be honored to hear what this stirred in you. A hush fell across the room again. Everyone turned toward Keanu. He didn't respond right away. He took a slow breath, his eyes softening, his shoulders relaxing just a little. He looked down at his knees, then back up. The air in the room shifted again, like the moment before thunder, or the first drop of rain on dry ground. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, I've spent most of my life trying to avoid talking about Jesus in places like this. And just like that, the room leaned forward. The film had ended, but the story, the real story, was just beginning. Keanu sat still, his hands resting on his knees, the weight of the moment pressing gently against him. All eyes were on him, but there was no pressure in the room. Only quiet, not the silence of expectation, but the silence of reverence. The kind of stillness that waits for truth without demanding it. He glanced up, met Mel's eyes, then looked around the room at the familiar faces. Directors, actors, producers, people he'd worked with, seen at award shows, shared green rooms and sets with. But tonight felt different. This wasn't a room full of professionals. It was a room full of human beings, each carrying something heavy they hadn't known how to name. Keanu took a breath. Deep, centered. Then he spoke. I've spent most of my life trying not to talk about Jesus. The room remained completely still. Not because I don't believe in something, he continued slowly, but because in this town, it's hard to speak about faith without it being turned into something else. He paused, letting the honesty settle. In Hollywood, even vulnerability can become a performance. Spirituality becomes marketing. And I never wanted that. I never wanted to cheapen something sacred by turning it into a soundbite. Mel's eyes softened, nodding gently. Keanu looked down again, the rhythm of his voice careful, reflective. But something about your film tonight. It didn't feel like performance. It didn't feel like message or doctrine. It felt like confession. And that stirred something in me I thought I had buried a long time ago. He paused again, collecting his thoughts, not for effect, but to make sure he was being true. I want to be honest, he said. What I'm about to share, I've never said out loud. Every breath in the room held still. I don't consider myself a religious person, Keanu continued. I didn't grow up with clear answers about God. My family was fractured, my childhood was full of instability, and when I lost people I loved, I didn't turn to faith. I turned inward. He looked up again, this time holding the gaze of no one in particular, and everyone all at once. But I always believed there had to be something more. Not something to fix things, just something that could make the pain feel less empty. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the air vent overhead. And in that silence, Keanu said, when I was at my lowest, when I couldn't fake strength anymore, I began to notice something. He let the words land slowly. I wasn't alone. Keanu's voice remained calm, but there was something behind it now. Not volume, not drama. Depth. The kind of quiet strength that only comes from having wrestled with questions that don't have easy answers. I didn't see angels, he said. I didn't hear voices, but I felt something. A presence. Not outside of me, but with me, like grief had always felt like I was drowning in a room full of people who couldn't see the water. And suddenly, I realized someone else was in the water too. He looked directly at Mel now. That's what your film reminded me of. Not just pain, but presence. Not resolution, just accompaniment. Tim started to speak, then quickly put his hand out as the word lingered in the room. There's a moment in the film, Keanu continued, when the main character sits in silence after everything has fallen apart. And no one comes to fix it. No big answer, no miracle. Just someone sitting beside him, quiet, steady. That scene hit me like a wave, because I've lived that moment. I've felt that kind of presence. He hesitated, then continued, voice soft but unwavering. I remember sitting in a small chapel in New York. This was maybe a year after Ava died. I hadn't planned to go in. I was just walking, trying not to feel anything, trying to outrun my own shadow. But something drew me in. A few people in the room leaned forward, drawn in by the clarity of his memory. There was no service, just an empty space and a few candles. I sat in the very back, in the dark, and I remember thinking, I'm not here to pray. I just don't want to be anywhere else right now. He paused. The pastor came out quietly. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't try to talk. He just lit a candle, stood in silence for a moment, and then walked away. That was it. But I remember feeling something shift inside me. Not a solution, not peace, just a kind of recognition. Like the grief that had swallowed me whole finally had a name. Keanu looked around the room. I realized then that faith, for me, wasn't about believing that everything would be okay. It was about not being alone when it wasn't. He let the words sink in, and that's where Jesus started showing up in my life. Not as a theological figure, not as someone I was told to believe in, but as a companion. Someone who understood pain not from a distance, but from the inside. The room remained breathless. I've spent so long trying to keep that part of me private, Keanu added, because I didn't want it misunderstood. I didn't want it commercialized. But your film, Mel, it reminded me that some truths aren't meant to be hidden. Not because they're comfortable, but because they're real. He folded his hands again. I'm not here to preach. I'm not here to explain Jesus. I'm just here to say that when I needed something real, he was there. Not to fix me, but to sit with me. Keanu paused, then took a deeper breath, as if lifting something heavier now, not for the room, but for himself. I think the reason I've never spoken about this publicly is because for so long, I thought faith had to look like certainty, like doctrine, like knowing things. But what I've experienced, it's quieter than that. It's not about belief. It's about being seen. He glanced toward the ceiling, then back to the crowd. I didn't find Jesus in success or love or comfort. I found him in pain, in the moments when I couldn't stand being alive, when I didn't want to wake up, when I hated the universe for how unfair it all seemed. And in those moments, when everything in me wanted to shut down, I felt something stay with me. A long silence followed, but no one interrupted. Not a cough, not a whisper, just stillness. I've had people tell me that faith is about strength, Keanu said. But I think they're wrong. I think it's about surrender. It's about saying, I can't do this alone, and being met by something that doesn't answer you with the solution, but with presence. He let his hands unfold, resting gently on the armrests. Sometimes I call that presence Jesus, sometimes I just call it grace. But whatever it is, it didn't run from my pain. It sat with me, in it. And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm speaking. Mel had tears in his eyes now, blinking slowly, hands clasped in front of his mouth, as if holding in a wave of emotion. Your film reminded me of something I nearly forgot, Keanu continued. That we don't need to be healed to be loved. We don't need to be strong to be seen. We don't need to be certain to be met. The words fell like soft rain. I don't know what anyone else believes in this room. I don't need to. But I just want to say, if you've ever felt like you had to be better, more spiritual, more together, more fixed before you could be loved, that's not the kind of love I've known. That's not the Jesus I've come to understand. He looked back at Mel now. So, thank you for making a film that doesn't pretend to solve pain. Thank you for reminding me that honesty is sacred, that silence can be holy, that presence, just showing up, can save someone. The room was silent, but not empty. It was full of shared weight, of tears held and released, of truths heard for the first time. And in that stillness, Keanu leaned back slightly and added, almost in a whisper, "I've never said this out loud, but maybe that's what faith really is, saying something true, even when you're not sure what comes next." He looked down, exhaled, and the entire room stayed still with him. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew that moment was sacred. Keanu sat quietly for a moment after finishing. The room was still holding the weight of what he had shared, but he wasn't done. There was something deeper beneath the surface, something more personal, and he could feel it pressing to be spoken. He inhaled slowly, then looked toward the floor as his voice dropped to a softer register. "I need to say something that I've never fully talked about," he said, "because it's the part of my life that shaped everything else." He let the silence settle before continuing. "Losing Ava changed me." The name alone carried so much gravity that the room almost physically shifted with it. Everyone knew the story, at least the public version. The daughter Keanu never got to raise, the child who was stillborn. But hearing him say her name in this space, in this moment, made it real in a way that tabloids and headlines never could. "When she died," he said, "it wasn't just grief. It was a kind of silence I didn't know existed, not just in the world around me, but in me, like a part of my soul had gone quiet. Completely quiet." He paused again, his hands gently folded in front of him. "And then River," he added, his voice cracking ever so slightly. "River's death wasn't something I could make sense of either. It happened so fast. One minute he was here, full of life, full of music, full of everything. And then," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "With her, River died," Keanu said, "I tried to go numb. I didn't know how to feel anything that wouldn't crush me. But when I lost her, I couldn't go numb anymore. I felt everything, all at once, and I hated God for that." Several people in the room looked down, not in judgment but in reverence. His honesty cut deep. It wasn't rebellion he was describing. It was heartbreak. "I didn't stop believing in God," he continued. "That's the thing. I didn't stop believing. I got angry, not the kind of anger that explodes, but the kind that corrodes, the kind that keeps you up at night asking questions that have no answers." He looked up slowly, scanning the faces in front of him. Where would a loving God allow a child to die before taking her first breath? Why would someone like River, someone with so much light, just vanish from this world like a blown-out candle? There was no response, just presence. Everyone understood that those questions weren't meant to be answered, they were meant to be honored. "And then one Sunday morning," Keanu said, "about 6 months after Ava, I don't know why, but I walked into a church. I didn't plan to go," Keanu said, his voice steady but low. "It wasn't something I thought about. I was just walking. The city was quiet. I passed by this old church on a corner in West Hollywood. I must have driven past 100 times. But that day, something made me stop." He paused, remembering. It was early, just after sunrise. The streets were still empty. I opened the heavy wooden door and walked in. No one greeted me. No one asked why I was there. I just sat down in the back pew. He let out a long breath before continuing. There were maybe 12 other people scattered around the room, most of them older, everyone sitting in silence. There was music playing softly from the front, but I wasn't listening to it. I just sat there, still. It was the first time in months I didn't feel the need to run. The room remained quiet, the weight of his memory shared by everyone present. The pastor came out a few minutes later. I don't remember his name. I don't even remember his face clearly. But I'll never forget what he said. Keanu leaned forward slightly, eyes focused. Dan, reading from the Gospel of Matthew, and then, almost halfway through his message, he quoted Jesus' words on the cross. my God, why have you forsaken me?" He stopped again. The words had landed with the same weight now as they did then. That verse hit something in me. I wasn't expecting it, but it stopped me cold. He looked around the room. For the first time, I heard something that matched what I was feeling. Not just sadness, not just grief, but that sense of being utterly abandoned by the very love that was supposed to hold you together. He took a moment before continuing. I remember thinking, finally someone understands. That verse, it wasn't theology to me, it was recognition. Jesus wasn't delivering a sermon in that moment. He was breaking, just like I had, just like I still was. A few people in the room had quietly wiped their eyes. Mel was completely still, his face wet but calm. That line, Keanu said, wasn't just a cry of despair. It was a mirror. I wasn't looking at a religious figure on a cross anymore. I was looking at someone who knew what it felt like to scream into the silence and wonder if anyone was listening. The truth in his voice was undeniable. And for me, that was the beginning of something, he added. Not healing, not yet, but something started to shift. He rested his hands again, breathing in slowly, grounding himself in the moment. I left the church before the service ended. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't even light a candle. I just walked out. But that verse, it followed me. Keanu looked down at his hands as he spoke, like the memory was still alive in his palms. For days after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My God, why have you forsaken me? It echoed in my mind, over and over. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized something that changed me. He paused, letting the emotion rise gently without forcing it. That moment wasn't Jesus giving up. It wasn't him losing faith. It was the deepest kind of faith. He looked up slowly, eyes filled with something tender. Because, he cried out, even when he felt abandoned, even when he felt alone, even when everything in him said, "You've been left behind," he still cried out. The room absorbed his words like soil drinking in rain. And I remember thinking, that's faith. That's what it means, not certainty, not control, but crying out anyway, even when you're not sure anyone's listening. He sat back a little in his chair, his voice growing softer, more reflective. Up until that point, I thought my anger at God meant I didn't believe anymore. But I realized, you don't get angry at someone who doesn't exist. You get angry at someone you're in relationship with, someone you trusted, someone who mattered. A wave of silence moved across the room as his words found their way into the hearts of every listener. I wasn't an atheist, Keanu continued. I was a son in mourning, and I was furious with the father I thought had gone silent. The vulnerability of his confession was both unsettling and healing. It was too honest to be comfortable, but too real to ignore. That service didn't give me peace, he said, but it cracked something open. It made space for something to grow. Not answers, not theology, just a whisper that maybe I wasn't alone in that darkness, that maybe someone had already been there, already cried those words, already carried that weight. Was holding his breath, eyes glistening. And I think that's what drew me back to faith, Keanu said quietly. Not the promise of clarity, but the invitation to presence. His voice fell even lower. I didn't need someone to fix my pain. I needed someone to sit in it with me. A hush followed that felt like a collective prayer, not spoken, just shared. Keanu's hands rested again in his lap, calm, steady. That moment in the church, he said, was the beginning of a long road. It didn't make the grief disappear, but it gave me permission to stop pretending it had to. He leaned back, eyes closed briefly. "And that," he whispered, "was the first moment in a very long time that I felt even a flicker of hope." The room stayed silent. No one moved, because they all knew something sacred had just been spoken. Keanu let the silence settle before continuing, his voice steady but low. "I've never forgotten what happened next in that service," he said. After the pastor read those words, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" he paused. The whole room went quiet. And then, without theatrics, without explanation, he said something that changed the direction of my entire life. He looked around slowly. Paul said, Jesus wasn't losing his faith in that moment. He was expressing the deepest kind of faith. Because real faith is when you cry out, even when you can't feel anything there to answer. Keanu exhaled. Dated, that hit me like a wave. I just sat there, in the back of that old church, frozen. Because it made something click that I'd never been able to articulate. He glanced down, folding his hands as his shoulders softened. For months after Ava died, I'd been carrying this anger, this unbearable sense of betrayal. I didn't even know who I was directing it at. The world, the universe, some God I wasn't sure existed. But the moment I heard those words about Jesus crying out, I realized. He paused, voice tightening with emotion. I realized I wasn't angry because I didn't believe. I was angry because I did. The room held its collective breath. You don't get angry at someone who's not there, Keanu continued. You don't feel abandoned by someone you never trusted. And that rage I'd been dragging behind me like a shadow, it wasn't the opposite of faith. It was a kind of relationship. A wounded one, but real. He looked up, locking eyes with no one and everyone at once. And that changed everything for me. The words landed gently, but with weight. Across the room, people looked down, some brushing their faces discreetly. Others simply sat in stillness. Mel's hand was clenched in front of his mouth, his jaw set, but his eyes softening more with each word. Keanu's tone shifted slightly, not louder, but more resolved. That realization, real faith, includes rage, doubt, pain. That tore down everything I thought I understood about belief. It made space for me to stay in the conversation with God, even when all I had left was silence and fury. He leaned forward slightly. Before that, I thought being spiritual meant being calm, being full of peace. But that moment taught me something completely different. It taught me that screaming into the void wasn't a failure of faith. It was a form of communion. He let the words rest in the air. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed for being angry anymore. Keanu took a slow breath, then continued. That Sunday, I left the church without saying a word to anyone. I didn't light a candle. I didn't kneel. I didn't sing. But something had cracked open in me. And it wasn't clarity. It was space. Space for honesty. Space for confusion. Space for grief. He paused for a long moment. And for faith. He looked out at the audience. I realized I didn't need to believe in a perfect God. I just needed to know that someone had stood in the same darkness I was in and still called out. That was enough. A woman in the back gently wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. A casting director beside her held a hand to her chest. The room was becoming more than an audience. It was becoming a witness. Everything I'd thought about religion before that, Keanu said, had felt like architecture, like buildings, rules, rituals. I always felt like I was on the outside of it, like I wasn't good enough. I didn't speak the language of faith the way other people did. He tilted his head slightly. But that moment in the church, hearing Jesus' cry of abandonment, that felt like something I did understand. Not theology, not doctrine, but pain. The kind that makes you question if love is real at all. His voice trembled slightly, but he didn't shy away from it. And somehow, knowing that Jesus felt that too, made me feel less alone. He looked at Mel now, speaking more directly. That's what your film captured so clearly, not just the pain, but the possibility that God isn't on the outside of it, looking down. He's in it. He's feeling it. He's breaking with us. Mel was barely holding himself together, his knuckles white against his chin. And it wasn't just that Jesus wept, Keanu added. It was that he wept knowing resurrection was coming. He wept anyway. He didn't skip the pain. He didn't dismiss it because hope was around the corner. He honored it. He stepped into it. And that's when I realized something I hadn't seen before. He leaned back slightly in his chair. I'd spent so much time waiting for God to fix the pain. But maybe God wasn't there to fix it. Maybe he was there to share it. There were no movements in the room now, just stillness. The kind of stillness that settles when people stop trying to be composed and just let themselves be present. That's when something shifted in me, Keanu said. Not instantly, not all at once, but gradually, over days and weeks and months, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. He paused, searching for the right word. Permission. He met the eyes of someone in the second row, a young actor who looked visibly shaken. Permission to grieve, permission to be angry, permission to stay in the relationship with God even when I didn't understand him at all. Keanu's voice grew quieter now, but stronger in presence. I stopped seeing faith as an achievement, he said, and started seeing it as a relationship. A hard, aching, beautiful, broken relationship. And like any relationship, it had silence, it had betrayal, it had rage, but it also had intimacy. And once I understood that, I couldn't go back to the way I saw God before. He looked at the floor for a second as if letting the weight of his own words pass through him. I used to think God was distant, a judge, a fixer, someone waiting for me to get it together. But what if he was just waiting for me to stop performing, to stop pretending I was okay? A tear slipped from the corner of Mel's eye. They in church didn't give me peace, Keanu said softly. It didn't erase anything, but it gave me a different starting point. I wasn't alone in the silence, and maybe, just maybe, I wasn't abandoned either. A few people in the room nodded slowly, others simply held their breath. This wasn't just storytelling anymore. It was shared memory, shared struggle, shared truth. Pain has a strange way of isolating us, he continued. We start to believe that if we're hurting, we must be doing something wrong, that if we had more faith, we'd feel better. But what I learned, I'm still learning, is that faith isn't about feeling better. It's about not walking away, even when you want to. He paused to steady himself, and I think Jesus understood that better than anyone. The room had become sacred, not because of ritual or candles or scripture, but because truth had made its way into every heart without asking for permission. Because suffering had found a voice that spoke with honesty, not instruction. Keanu looked around slowly, then added, "That's why I don't call myself a traditional believer. I don't fit the mold. I don't check the boxes. But I know what it feels like to cry out to God and believe the silence means you're forgotten. And then slowly discover that the silence was actually shared." He inhaled deeply. Since that day, I've had many more moments of grief, of anger, of confusion. But they don't feel empty anymore because now I understand. Crying out doesn't mean you've lost your faith. It means you're still in the conversation. And then, with a voice so low it almost cracked, and that conversation, no matter how broken, is still a relationship. The final line settled over the room like a benediction. For a long time, no one spoke. There was nothing to add. Because in that one moment, a truth had been spoken so clearly, so vulnerably, that even Hollywood knew. They had just witnessed something sacred. Keanu sat with his hands loosely folded, his eyes focused not on the room, but on something farther away. A memory. A place he'd carried with him in silence for years. He drew a slow breath and began speaking again. "There's a moment I think about a lot," he said. "It happened a few months after that church service I told you about. I was still broken, still lost. But I'd started to let myself feel again, not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't keep shutting it out." He shifted slightly in his seat. "It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because it was one of those rare days when I had nothing scheduled. No press, no meetings, no obligations. I woke up early and decided to walk through Griffith Park. I used to go there when I needed to think. But that morning felt different." The room remained silent as his voice dropped into something slower, almost weightless. There was this heavy fog hanging over the hills, the kind that makes everything feel muted, like the world is holding its breath. I kept my hood up, hands in my pockets. I wasn't trying to run from anything. I wasn't looking for clarity. I was just moving, step after step, trying not to drown in the quiet. He paused. "But grief doesn't care how far you walk. It follows." Keanu's words grew more gentle, more precise. I remember stopping near a wooden bench on one of the side trails. It overlooked this small, sloping field where the dew hadn't yet burned off. There wasn't anyone else around, just the sound of leaves shifting in the wind and the low rustle of something in the brush nearby. I stood there and suddenly felt this stillness. He looked up for the first time since beginning. Not emptiness, not numbness, stillness. He placed a hand gently over his chest, as if grounding himself in the moment. And I swear, I could feel something standing beside me, not watching me, not judging, just there, present, like someone had walked up next to me and chosen not to say anything out loud, just chosen to stay. A hush filled the room again. It wasn't dramatic. There was no vision, no voice from the sky, but I felt it. That presence, quiet, steady, with me. He paused, and his next words came slowly. I whispered, "Jesus," not as a prayer, not as a plea, just as a question. Like calling out to someone you think you recognize in a crowd, but you're not sure. His eyes filled, but his voice didn't break. And in that stillness, I felt something answer, not in words, but in knowing. I heard, or maybe understood. I know. I've been here the whole time. Keanu paused, letting the weight of that moment settle between them all. It wasn't loud, he said. It wasn't even outside me. It felt like it came from somewhere deeper, like the response was made of silence, but also unmistakably alive. He looked around the room slowly. I didn't move. I didn't speak again. I just stood there, in that fog, with tears falling down my face, not from sadness, but from something else, something like being recognized after wandering lost for too long. He leaned forward slightly in his chair, fingers loosely intertwined. I'd spent so much time believing I had to get better before I could be in the presence of God. I thought grief was a wall. I thought anger was proof I was too far gone. But that moment, that presence, it didn't wait for me to be healed. It didn't wait for me to believe properly. It didn't need me to change. He swallowed, then said slowly, "It was just there, with me." People in the room were holding tissues, blinking away tears, not out of politeness, but because the experience Keanu was sharing was so specific, yet somehow familiar. That moment became an anchor, he continued. Not because it solved anything, but because it made one thing clear. I wasn't alone, and maybe I never had been. He rested his hands on his knees. For years, I had imagined faith as a journey toward perfection, a climb toward light. But what I felt that day wasn't light above me. It was companionship beside me. Not a ladder, a presence. His eyes drifted upward slightly, like he could still see that bench, the fog, the field below. I didn't tell anyone about it, Keanu admitted. Not my friends, not my therapist, not even the people I was closest to. It felt too delicate, too sacred, like speaking it out loud would make it disappear. He smiled faintly. But it didn't disappear. It stayed. He looked at Mel directly now. And I think that's what your film touched for me, Mel. That quiet moment. The stranger in the chapel who doesn't speak but just sits. That's what divine love felt like that day. Not explanation, not rescue. Just someone sitting beside me in the dark. Mel's face was wet now. Hands folded tightly beneath his chin, visibly moved. Keanu continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It's easy to think of Jesus as a healer, a miracle worker, a symbol of something distant. But that day in the park, I didn't meet a symbol. I didn't meet an idea. I met someone willing to walk beside me, even when I had nothing to give in return. The audience stayed absolutely still. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of being broken in front of God. Keanu let the last sentence linger before continuing. That moment didn't come with fanfare. It didn't fix my grief. Ava was still gone. River was still gone. The ache was still there. But it was no longer hollow. It had company. He took another breath, steady, grounded. I didn't feel comforted. I felt accompanied, and that was enough. The phrase carried a quiet power, sinking deep into everyone listening. After that morning in Griffith Park, I started walking there more often, Keanu said. Not because I expected something supernatural to happen again, but because it became a place where I didn't have to perform, where I could show up in silence and just be. Broken, messy, still grieving, still confused, and not feel ashamed of any of it. He paused to look around the room. I think we talk too much about healing as something we have to reach, some perfect version of ourselves we're supposed to become. But I don't think that's what divine love is about. At least, not the love I met in the park that day. His voice grew gentler. Jesus didn't show up to tell me how to fix my life. He didn't tell me to pray harder or believe more. He just stood with me in the fog. And I've come to believe that's what grace really is. Not rescue, not instruction, but presence. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze deepening. Sometimes I think the miracle isn't that we get answers. Sometimes the miracle is that we're not alone in the absence of them. He let that truth breathe. I didn't find peace that day, but I found something better. Belonging. I didn't feel like an outsider to God anymore. I felt like someone who had been seen, not for who I could become, but for who I already was. Wounded, confused, and still worthy of companionship. Mel had his head bowed now, quietly weeping. Keanu spoke one last time in that soft, unshaken tone. That moment became the foundation for everything I've come to believe. Not in a system, not in a doctrine, but in a person. A presence that doesn't run when things fall apart. A love that doesn't flinch at our worst pain. That's what met me in Griffith Park. He placed his hands flat on his thighs, the story complete, the silence holy. I still walk there sometimes, he said. And when I do, I don't look for signs, I just remember that he was there, and that he never left. For a long while, no one spoke, because what had just been shared wasn't a testimony. It was an encounter, and everyone in that room knew they would never forget it. Keanu sat still for a moment after speaking, as if letting the weight of the memory pass fully through him before continuing. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, slower, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence for what came next. The weeks after that morning in Griffith Park weren't peaceful. he said. They were actually more confusing than anything. I kept asking myself if what I felt was real, or if it was just my mind trying to comfort itself. He looked down at his hands. I mean, I'm an actor, he continued. I've spent most of my life inhabiting other people's emotions, living in fictional spaces, feeling things on cue. So it's not hard to believe that maybe I created that moment. Maybe I imagined that presence, just to survive. He let that sentence hang in the air. I wrestled with that possibility for days. I would replay the moment in my mind again and again, trying to analyze it like a scene from a film. Was there a cue? A trigger? Did I just want it to be real so badly that my brain invented it? A few people in the room nodded slowly, deeply connecting with the doubt he was expressing. But the strange thing was, I couldn't dismiss it. No matter how many times I tried to talk myself out of it, something had shifted. Something fundamental. My grief hadn't disappeared, my anger was still there, the losses were still real. But I didn't feel alone in them anymore. He paused. I didn't know how to explain it. I still don't. But I remember walking into my kitchen one morning, pouring coffee like I always did, and realizing the silence in the room didn't feel hostile anymore. It wasn't cold. It wasn't empty. It just was. And I wasn't afraid of it. He folded his hands again. I had spent so long treating silence as a punishment, as evidence that God wasn't there. But after that walk, something changed. The silence became sacred. It became a space where I could breathe again. Mel remained frozen, eyes locked on Keanu, hands unmoving. The question I kept asking myself, Keanu said, was, what if that moment in the park wasn't proof of something outside me, but proof of something already inside me, that I'd been too afraid to trust? He took a breath, looking around the room, because whether it was divine intervention or a moment of psychological clarity, or both, I couldn't deny what followed. My pain didn't vanish, but it stopped feeling like a solitary experience. And that changed everything. Keanu sat with his shoulders relaxed now, not because the weight had lifted, but because he had accepted it would always be there. And maybe that was okay. I didn't tell anyone what I was going through, he said. I didn't want it reduced to something sentimental. I didn't want to talk about Jesus like a phase or an idea I was entertaining. I was still unsure what it all meant, but the feeling that something had changed, that was undeniable. He glanced toward the window at the far end of the room, where the last streaks of daylight filtered through the curtains. For years, he said slowly, I had believed pain meant distance, that if I was hurting, God must be far away. But after the park, the pain was still there, just not as lonely. A few audience members were crying quietly now. One woman had her hand pressed gently over her mouth, tears streaming down her cheek. Another man, an older cinematographer, nodded with eyes full of grief. They knew that pain. They had carried it too. I kept waking up in the middle of the night, Keanu continued, still haunted by dreams, still aching with absence. But there was this difference I couldn't explain. I no longer felt like I had to fight the grief. I just had to be with it. He looked at Mel again, and somehow I began to believe that God wasn't watching me from a distance, but sitting with me in it. Not giving me answers, not rescuing me. Just staying. He smiled faintly, the kind that holds both sorrow and peace at once. There were mornings when I wanted to forget that moment in the park ever happened. I'd think, maybe it was just emotional fatigue. Maybe I broke under the weight of everything and conjured up a presence to soothe myself. I'd argue with my own memory, try to pull it apart. He looked down, letting a beat of silence pass. But then I'd walk past someone crying on a street corner or see a father holding his child a little tighter than necessary, and I'd feel it again, that sense of shared grief. That sense that we're not meant to carry this alone. His voice softened even more. I think that's what started to reshape my understanding of faith. Not as a solution, not even as hope, but as relationship. The kind of relationship that's willing to sit with you through the nights when nothing makes sense. He paused again, and when he spoke next, it was almost in a whisper. The pain didn't go away, but it wasn't mine alone anymore. He looked out over the audience, and the truth of his words landed in their faces like light breaking through the edge of a long storm. That single change, he said, was enough to begin again. Keanu leaned back in his seat, hands resting on his thighs, voice steady now with a kind of quiet conviction. In the weeks that followed, I didn't become a different person. I didn't suddenly wake up joyful or free, but I stopped pretending I had to be okay. I gave myself permission to be exactly where I was, with all the grief, the doubt, and the lingering anger. He looked at the crowd, many of whom had tears streaking down their cheeks. I began noticing little things. Not miracles, just moments. A stranger holding a door. A child laughing in the park. A letter I'd forgotten I wrote, showing up at just the right time. None of them solved anything, but they reminded me of that quiet presence, like gentle echoes of that morning. He paused. I used to think the opposite of faith was doubt, but I don't believe that anymore. I think the opposite of faith is pretending. Pretending we're fine when we're broken, pretending we've got it together when our hearts are barely beating. A wave of emotion moved through the room, and I had spent too long pretending, he said. For my career, for my public image, for my own survival. But faith didn't show up when I was polished and perfect. It showed up when I had nothing left. He exhaled slowly. That's when I started calling out again. Not in desperation, not expecting answers, but just to keep the connection alive. I'm still here, I'd whisper, and somewhere deep inside, I felt the response, so am I. He smiled softly, not out of happiness, but out of something deeper. Relief. I don't share this story because I think everyone should feel what I felt. I don't share it because I think I've figured anything out. I haven't. I'm still learning how to carry what I carry. But I share it because, for the first time, I realized I wasn't carrying it alone. Mel sat frozen, tears running freely down his face. His lips were parted, as if trying to speak but unable to find words. His hands were folded tightly together, pressed against his chest. I still don't know what exactly happened that day in the park, Keanu said. But I know what came after. A shift. A softness. A willingness to stay present with my pain instead of escaping it. And that presence, whether it was divine or internal or both, has never left. He looked at the faces in front of him, many of them no longer actors or executives or influencers. Just people. Just human beings trying to make sense of pain and beauty at the same time. And that, Keanu said, voice full of stillness, was the beginning of real faith for me. Not faith in answers, faith in presence. And with that, the room remained silent, not out of restraint, but out of reverence. Because in that moment, everyone understood. Faith begins not when the pain ends, but when we stop pretending we're alone in it. Keanu took a breath and leaned slightly forward. His voice was gentler now, but no less focused. After that shift, he said, after I stopped seeing faith as a ladder I was supposed to climb, I found myself drawn to something I hadn't touched in years. The Gospels. He glanced around the room. I wasn't reading them to find answers. I wasn't searching for theology. I wasn't looking to prove anything right or wrong. I just wanted to know how Jesus handled unanswered questions, how he lived in the middle of pain that didn't get fixed. He looked down briefly, then back up. I started noticing something I had missed before. Every time I had read the Gospels in the past, I was looking for lessons, for meaning. But this time, I was just looking at how he moved, where he went, who he sat with. He paused, and what I found hit me hard. The room stayed perfectly still. Jesus didn't spend most of his time with powerful people. He didn't spend it with those who had it all together. He didn't chase the influential. He wasn't campaigning. He wasn't promoting anything. He walked straight into the lives of the broken. Keanu's voice deepened slightly with emotion. The lepers, the outcasts, the tax collectors, the people nobody wanted to touch. He didn't preach at them. He didn't give them 3-step programs for recovery. He didn't fix them to make himself look holy. He paused again. Helen just sat with them. The sentence landed like a quiet revelation. Hell didn't love people into being better. He just loved them. Keanu looked down as the truth of that hit him again, even in retelling. And the crazy thing is, he continued, some of them didn't get better. Some of them didn't transform into these glowing models of virtue. But he stayed. He didn't leave because they were still broken. That reframing shook something in him. All my life, he said, I thought divine love was supposed to improve you, that it was about becoming someone worthy of it, but that wasn't what I saw anymore. What I saw was someone who entered brokenness without the expectation that it needed to be immediately fixed. He exhaled slowly, and that changed the way I lived with my pain. There were tears again in the audience, a quiet, shared ache. Before, I saw my grief as a flaw, Keanu admitted, a failure to heal. But now, I started to see it as something sacred, not because it was good, but because it was honest. And if Jesus wasn't afraid to sit with the wounded, then maybe I didn't have to be afraid to sit with mine. Keanu's voice remained soft, but there was clarity in every word. I kept reading, he said, but slower this time, not rushing through the stories, not trying to get to the miracles. I just sat with the moments where Jesus sat with people. He looked ahead, eyes fixed on some invisible thread pulling through the memory. There's this one passage where he meets a man born blind, and the disciples immediately start asking whose sin caused it. They want an explanation, a reason, someone to blame. Keanu shook his head gently. But Jesus doesn't play that game. He doesn't give them the answer they expect. He just kneels down and heals the man. No lecture, no theology, just compassion. He looked toward Mel now. That stuck with me, he said, because that's how I had been approaching my own pain, trying to analyze it, explain it, figure out what I did wrong to deserve it. But Jesus didn't seem interested in that. He paused. Men have just responded to suffering with presence, with love. The room sat in rapt attention. Not one person looked away. I realized I had spent years trying to earn comfort, Keanu said, trying to earn peace. Like if I could be more grateful, more positive, more forgiving, I'd finally feel better. He inhaled slowly. But that's not how Jesus moved. He didn't wait for people to be grateful or even good. He met them exactly where they were, and he didn't ask for anything in return. Keanu's voice thickened just slightly. I think the most radical thing about him is how often he let people stay broken. He didn't rush them toward healing. He didn't demand transformation as a condition of his love. He just saw them. And that kind of seeing, it's rare. Even now, he looked around the room. We live in a world obsessed with self-improvement, with transformation, with redemption arcs. But what if the most powerful kind of love isn't the kind that changes us? It's the kind that stays when we don't change. A few quiet sobs could be heard in the room. They weren't disruptive. They were sacred, shared. That realization started to change the way I approached my own life, Keanu continued. I stopped asking, when will I get over this? And started asking, how can I live with this, honestly? He smiled faintly. I stopped trying to fix my pain. I started trying to listen to it. He folded his hands together again, grounding himself. And slowly my days became different. Not brighter, not easier, but more honest. I let myself be sad without apologizing. I let myself doubt without pretending I had answers. I let myself grieve without needing a resolution. Keanu continued, his voice quiet but clear. I started seeing my pain not as something to defeat, but something to hold, not because I wanted to stay in it forever, but because I finally understood that it was part of the story, not a detour, not a punishment, but part of what made me human. He looked toward the front of the room, where Mel hadn't moved an inch. His eyes were locked on Keanu, his face a reflection of deep stillness and awe. I used to pray for healing, Keanu said. Now, I pray for presence. I don't ask to be rescued from the grief. I ask for the strength to stay in it without collapsing. And somehow, that's where I've found God most clearly. Not in the escape, but in the staying. He took a breath. That's what the Gospels taught me, reading them again with a broken heart. That Jesus didn't walk around demanding belief. He walked around offering presence. And that presence changed people, not always their circumstances, but their sense of being alone in them. He paused again, not for effect, but because the truth deserved a moment of quiet. I used to think I had to be good to be loved, he said. Now I know. I just have to be honest. A few people wiped their eyes. A man in the back, an executive known for his stoicism, lowered his head and quietly wept into his sleeve. That reframing gave me permission to stop pretending, Keanu added, to stop aiming for spiritual success and instead start cultivating spiritual honesty. He looked down at his hands, then back up with a calm expression. I no longer ask, why did this happen to me? I've stopped looking for meaning in the loss. I've started asking a different question. How can I carry this in a way that honors the love that came before the loss? The room was absolutely still. No phones buzzed. No one shifted in their seat. Everyone was present, heart and soul. That's how Jesus changed for me, Keanu said, his voice softening to a near whisper. He stopped being a figure I was supposed to believe in and became a companion who understood what it meant to feel abandoned, to bleed, to cry, to carry something he didn't deserve and do it anyway, because love required it. He exhaled. And now, I don't ask him to remove my brokenness. I ask him to stay in it with me. He looked toward Mel once more. And every time I feel like I'm slipping, like I can't carry it another step, I go back to the Gospels. Not for doctrine, not for proof, but just to watch him walk through the broken world, choosing again and again to stay with the ones everyone else left behind. He let his hands rest gently, and that more than anything has taught me how to live. Keanu sat still for a long moment after his last words. His gaze lowered, fingers woven gently in his lap. When he looked up again, there was something different in his eyes. Not clarity, not peace, but surrender. I want to be honest about something, he said softly. This way of seeing Jesus. It didn't come easily. I resisted it for a long time. His voice was steady, but his shoulders carried the weight of confession. He used to prefer anger, not because it felt good, but because it was simple. Anger gave me something to hold, something sharp, something clear. Grief was a fog, but anger had edges. He looked around the room, many heads nodding slightly, silently understanding. And part of me didn't want to let go of that edge, he admitted, because this idea of a love that doesn't need to fix you, it felt dangerous. If I let that in, I wasn't sure I'd ever come back. He paused, letting the tension sit with everyone. For years, I had this unspoken deal with God, Keanu said. If I could be strong, if I could survive the pain and carry it alone, maybe I wouldn't have to rely on anything outside of myself. Maybe I could avoid needing anyone, especially him. He gave a faint, almost sad smile, but I was wrong. He folded his hands tighter. I kept trying to turn faith into something useful, a solution, a shield, something I could use to protect myself from future loss. But it didn't work that way. His eyes found the carpet for a moment, then returned to the audience. It wasn't until I let that version of faith fall apart that something deeper started to grow. He leaned in slightly. I finally realized Jesus wasn't offering me rescue. He wasn't saying, "Follow me and I'll take your pain away." He was saying, "I see it. I know it. Let me walk through it with you." The weight of those words settled across the room. "That shift," Keanu said slowly, "changed everything." He looked up, eyes calm but moist with memory. My grief didn't disappear. The ache for Ava, for River, it's still there. But something in me stopped fighting it. I started walking with it instead of around it. And I stopped walking alone. Keanu paused and then continued, his tone thoughtful and low. "I used to think faith was supposed to make you strong," he said, "unshakable, like armor. But the more I lived with my grief, the more I realized that kind of strength made me brittle. I wasn't healing. I was just hiding." He let the silence hold for a second, his hands motionless in his lap. "And when I finally dropped the armor, I didn't find emptiness. I didn't fall apart like I feared. What I found was something unexpected." He looked up. "I found companionship." There was a soft gasp from someone near the front row, followed by the subtle sound of a sniffle. "Jesus didn't fix me," Keanu said. "He didn't take away the hole left by Ava, or the confusion after River, or the ache that comes from years of losing things you thought were unbreakable." He nodded slightly, as if accepting that truth again in real time. "But," he showed me how to carry it, how to let the weight of it rest in a shared space. He looked up again, this time scanning the entire room. "That's what made me let go of the shield. Because I wasn't protecting myself, I was isolating myself." He exhaled deeply, his voice softening further. "Faith stopped being a weapon. It stopped being a system of beliefs. It became something quieter, something human." He glanced at the floor, then back to the people before him. "Sometimes it looks like just sitting still. Sometimes it looks like crying in your car. Sometimes it looks like reaching out to someone you haven't spoken to in years. But whatever it looks like, it's shared." His words were slow and deliberate, as though each one had been carried and lived before being spoken. "I stopped needing to have it all figured out," Keanu said. "I stopped needing answers to every question, because I realized the questions were part of the connection." He gave a slight nod, as if affirming something only he could fully feel. "It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be in the middle of something. And it's okay to not know how it ends. Because Jesus never asked me to be certain, he just asked me to stay open." That line settled deep in the room. Even the air felt reverent. Keanu let it linger, then leaned back gently. "I used to be afraid that if I didn't have strong beliefs, I didn't have real faith. But now I think faith isn't about how loudly you believe. It's about how gently you're willing to stay." Keanu sat still for a moment before speaking again, his voice lower, more grounded. "I think for a long time I confused silence with absence," he said. "When I prayed and didn't hear anything back, I thought it meant I was alone. But now, I see it differently." He paused. "Maybe the silence wasn't empty. Maybe it was a kind of presence I didn't know how to recognize yet." The room held its breath. "I've stopped asking for signs," he continued. "Not because I've given up, but because I've learned that love doesn't always show itself with thunder. Sometimes it just stays, quiet, patient, unmoving." He let that sit for a beat before continuing. "I don't walk into churches looking for answers anymore. I walk in to sit with the mystery, to be reminded that I'm not the only one who doesn't understand everything but still chooses to hope anyway." He looked at Mel now, the weight of everything they had both endured forming a quiet bridge between them. "And that's what shifted in me. I stopped needing faith to solve me. I started letting it accompany me. A tear slid down someone's cheek in the back row. No one noticed, because everyone was doing the same. There was a time, Keanu said softly, when I thought healing would mean forgetting, moving on, rebuilding. But I don't believe that anymore. He clasped his hands gently. I think healing is when you learn to bring your broken parts with you, without shame. When you stop trying to go back to who you were before the pain, and instead learn to live with who you've become because of it. He drew in a breath. And for me, Jesus became not a symbol of what I should be, but a presence that tells me I'm still loved, even when I don't know who I am. The room was quiet. Holy, no one dared move. Keanu nodded faintly and said, almost to himself, faith didn't make me strong, it made me honest. Then he looked up again and said clearly, and that's when I finally understood. Jesus never promised to erase the pain. He promised to enter it with us and walk beside us, step by step. There was no applause, just reverence. In that moment, the shift in Keanu's heart wasn't something he explained. It was something everyone in the room could feel. Keanu's hands rested quietly on his knees. His voice dropped into a tone almost too soft to hear, but the entire room leaned forward. There was one moment in Scripture that changed everything for me, he began. A single line I had read before, but this time, it undid me. He looked at no one in particular. His eyes seemed focused on a distant memory only he could see. It was the story of Lazarus, Keanu said. You know, the man Jesus raised from the dead. There were small nods around the room, but no one interrupted. What broke me, he continued, was that Jesus knew he was going to bring Lazarus back. He knew resurrection was coming, and still, he wept. His voice caught slightly. Hell didn't skip the pain. He didn't say, don't worry, it'll be fine in 5 minutes. He stood there, and he cried. Keanu's voice cracked on that word, cried, and for a brief moment, his face tilted toward the floor. Lee undid me, he said again, this time quieter. Because I'd always thought the cross was about punishment, about justice, about fixing something. But that story, it showed me something different. He drew in a breath and continued. Jesus didn't come to explain pain. He came to feel it with us. He looked up now, the vulnerability in his eyes drawing in everyone around him. I used to think God stayed on the outside, watching. But in that moment, watching Jesus cry for a man he was about to save, I realized something. He paused to let the thought settle. He wasn't punished for us, he was suffering with us. The silence in the room deepened. No one looked away. Even Mel's hands were clasped tightly, his knuckles pale. Keanu didn't rush. He let the sacred stillness hold. That one image, he said softly, Jesus crying, even when he had the power to reverse death, that broke something open in me. He shifted slightly in his chair, exhaling. It meant I didn't have to explain my pain anymore. I didn't have to justify it, or compare it, or spiritualize it. It meant maybe it was okay to just feel it. He swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper now. If Jesus cried for his friend, then I didn't have to be ashamed for crying for mine. Keanu let the silence linger, his voice steadier now. I started realizing that what I'd been running from wasn't pain itself. It was the idea that pain made me weak, that somehow, if I was grieving or angry or confused, I was failing at faith. He shook his head gently. But when I saw Jesus weep, even with resurrection in his hands, it showed me that divine love isn't afraid of sorrow. It doesn't rush it. It doesn't avoid it. It steps into it. His voice warmed, carrying conviction without force. For the first time, I saw Jesus not as a rescuer dropping down from above, but as someone who sat down beside me. He paused, then said slowly, That's the kind of savior I didn't know I needed. A few people wiped their eyes. A producer near the back let out a trembling breath she didn't know she was holding. Keanu's gaze moved across the room, gently. Every version of God I'd been handed growing up seemed distant, demanding, holy in a way that meant far away. But this Jesus? This man who stopped to weep, even knowing the ending? He was something else. He rested his hands again, leaning forward slightly. Who wasn't just God above, he was God with. The phrase hung in the air like incense, slow and sacred. And that presence, Keanu said, became the quiet answer I didn't know I'd been waiting for. His words slowed, letting each one breathe. I didn't need a reason for my losses. I didn't need a fix. I just needed to know I hadn't been left alone in them. A tear formed in the corner of his eye, but he didn't blink it away. Jesus wept for someone he loved, even though he was about to bring him back. That taught me something. Holy lives in grief, too. He sat back slightly, voice growing softer again. I stopped seeing God as the one who takes the pain away, and started seeing him as the one who joins me in it. Another pause. That changed everything. It changed how I see prayer, how I see compassion, how I see myself. He exhaled, his words gaining quiet gravity. When someone's hurting now, I don't try to fix it. I try to sit with it. Because that's what love did for me. The room seemed to lean in closer. And when I say Jesus is real to me, Keanu added, I don't mean in the way people sometimes argue about religion, theology, proofs. He placed a hand gently on his chest. I mean here, in the ache, in the stillness, in the long, hard walks when there's nothing to say, but someone still stays beside you. Keanu's voice softened to a hush, but it carried more weight than anything he had said before. There's something holy about not being alone, when everything inside you feels broken. He nodded slowly, almost as if affirming it to himself again. Before, I thought God would come in and clean up the mess. But what I've come to believe is that God enters the mess and sits with you until you're not afraid of it anymore. A few in the audience blinked back tears. Others closed their eyes, as if praying silently. I don't talk about this often, Keanu continued, because it's not the kind of thing you say in interviews or red carpets. It doesn't fit into headlines or sound bites. He paused. But it's real. It's the most real thing I know. His eyes shimmered with emotion as he continued. And the more I let myself sit with that image, Jesus crying at the tomb, the more I stopped needing everything to be fixed. He leaned forward just slightly, his voice gentle. Because love that stays, love that weeks with you even when healing is on the way, that's not weakness. That's the strongest kind of presence there is. Someone in the back let out a small sob. No one turned to look. Keanu didn't acknowledge it with words. He didn't need to. He just let the silence stretch like a blanket over the room. He took a breath, steady and deep. And now, he said, when I think of God, I don't imagine thunder or fire or judgment. I imagine tears. Another pause. To imagine eyes that see everything and still don't look away. He gave a faint, almost reverent smile. I think that's what divine love really is. Not an answer, not control, not even strength in the way we measure it. He gestured softly. Just presence. Relentless, tender presence. Keanu looked around the room again, not for effect, but for connection. Mel, your film reminded me of that. It wasn't just storytelling. It was honesty. It was confession. Mel, still silent in the front row, nodded slowly, his lips pressed tightly, eyes glassy with emotion. Keanu's words grew more deliberate. When I watched your movie tonight, I didn't feel preached to. I felt accompanied. And that's the highest form of truth. I know. He let the silence return one final time. Jesus didn't come to fix the world in the way we expect. He came to enter it, to carry it, to cry with it, and that That's the kind of savior I believe in. No one clapped, no one spoke, but something had shifted in that room. Something invisible, something real. Keanu sat quietly for a moment after his final words in the last section. The room didn't move. No phones buzzed, no one coughed. The air was too full for anything else. Then Keanu looked at Mel directly this time. Not as a fellow actor or director, but as a man. As someone who knew what it meant to ache. He said, "There's one more thing I want to share. It's taken me years to understand." The entire room leaned forward again. Jesus didn't come to remove suffering. He came to inhabit it. The words landed slowly, quietly, and with force. He let them echo in the stillness before continuing. "For a long time, I wanted my pain to go away. I prayed, sometimes begged, that it would disappear, that the emptiness would lift, but it didn't." He paused. What changed wasn't the pain. What changed was realizing I wasn't the only one feeling it. Keanu exhaled deeply, then pressed his palms together loosely. "Every time I miss Ava, when her birthday comes around, or when I see someone who reminds me of her, I feel this sharpness inside me, this hole that still hasn't closed." He looked down, then back up again. "And every time I think of River, how he left, how sudden and senseless it was, I still feel that ache in my chest." He grew still for a long moment and then said, "But now, when those feelings hit, I remember something." His voice dropped to a softer tone. "I remember that Jesus felt that too." He looked around the room with a quiet boldness. Not as a metaphor, not as a sermon, as a human being. Someone in the front row let out a small breath, like they'd been holding it for too long. Hell knew what it meant to love and lose, to hunger and not be fed, to cry out and not hear an answer right away. Keanu's voice remained calm, grounded, knowing that it didn't erase the pain, but it gave it a companion. He took another breath and spoke with raw clarity. "I used to think resurrection meant getting back what you lost, like life would return to what it was before." He shook his head gently. "But I don't believe that anymore." He looked at the wall ahead, speaking slowly now. "Resurrection isn't about erasing pain. It's about walking through it and still standing." His words came out heavy but sure. "It's the breath you take after weeping, the morning light after a sleepless night. It's not perfect, but it's real." Mel's eyes had been locked on him for several minutes. His hand moved once to his chest, then fell back to his lap. His jaw was tight, his throat moved as he swallowed. And then, without hiding it, a tear finally broke from Mel's right eye. It slid slowly down his cheek, and he made no attempt to brush it away. Keanu saw it. He nodded once, not in triumph, but in understanding. Keanu didn't pause long. His voice returned, quieter but anchored. "I think people misunderstand grief. They think it's something to move past or conquer. But I've come to believe grief is love that has nowhere else to go." The weight of that sentence filled the air. "So when I grieve Ava, when I grieve River, I don't try to fight it anymore. I let the love move through me, even if it hurts. Because I know I'm not grieving alone." He glanced again at Mel, then to the room. "And that's what faith became for me. Not a shield, not a rescue plan, but the awareness that love still surrounds you, even in pain." Somewhere near the middle of the room pressed a hand to their mouth. An older actress, her mascara softly blurred, nodded slowly, eyes glistening. Keanu leaned forward in his seat. "Mel, your film showed something that rarely gets shown. Not the heroic faith, but the honest kind. The kind that breaks before it heals. The kind that cries before it speaks." Mel blinked, hard, his lips trembling slightly. He looked down, then back up at Keanu with eyes that were red but wide open. Keanu's words slowed even more, letting each one drop like stone into still water. When I heard that line in your film, the one where the character says, "God never left, we just stopped looking for him in the dark," it undid something in me. He smiled gently, painfully. I realized I'd been staring into my own shadows for years, hoping for a light that would erase them. But what I really needed was someone who would enter them with me. A moment passed, and I believe Jesus did. He didn't elaborate, he didn't raise his voice. He just said it, plainly. And that was what made it land with such power. The entire room sat in reverent quiet. No phones, no buzzing distractions. Just breathing, feeling, being. Keanu looked at the floor a moment, then back up. I'm not a preacher, I'm not a theologian. I'm just a man who's lost people and wondered what to do. With the silence. He looked around again. But tonight, I just wanted to say, sometimes that silence isn't empty. Sometimes it's sacred. Mel's eyes brimmed again and his shoulders softened. He looked older for a moment. Not weaker, just deeply human. Keanu smiled softly at him. Thank you for making a film that tells the truth. Not the polished truth, but the kind that bleeds. Mel whispered hoarsely, barely audible across the front row. Thank you for sharing yours. The moment settled like dusk in the room. Slow, gentle, whole. And without anyone moving, a quiet new beginning had already started. The room remained suspended in silence long after Keanu stopped speaking. No one moved, no one reached for their glass, no one checked their phone. It was the kind of silence that felt like something holy had passed through. Then Mel Gibson slowly stood. For a second, he just looked at Keanu, as if trying to find the words to match what he felt. His eyes were red. His jaw tightened once, then released. He looked down, then back up. I don't know what to say, he began, voice raw. I really don't. Keanu offered a soft nod of encouragement, but didn't speak. Mel turned slightly, as if addressing not just Keanu, but everyone present. I've made films about faith, films about sacrifice, justice, redemption. I've spent decades trying to portray what grace looks like. And I thought if I could just get it right, just make it real enough, I'd feel it myself. He swallowed hard, pausing to steady his breath. But sitting here tonight, listening to you, it hit me. I've been trying to earn it. He looked down at his hands, then back up. Through art, through devotion, through guilt. The confession cracked something in his voice. His next words came slower. I thought if I punished myself enough, worked hard enough, repented loud enough, maybe then I'd be worthy of God's love. A few heads nodded in the room, eyes already damp. Keanu remained still, eyes locked on Mel. Not with judgment, but deep understanding. But you, Mel said, turning directly to Keanu, you didn't try to convince us. You didn't preach. You just let us see you. His voice softened with awe. And that's the first time I think I've actually tasted what grace feels like. Mel's voice broke. Not something earned, not something justified, just presence. He wiped one eye, but didn't hide the rest of the tears. I didn't know how much I needed that. The vulnerability in Mel's voice stunned the room more than any monologue he had ever delivered on screen. There was no acting here, just a man unraveling and being stitched back together, in front of friends and strangers alike. Keanu finally spoke, softly. I think a lot of us have spent our lives thinking we had to perform to be loved, even quietly, even unconsciously. He paused. But I don't think that's what Jesus was about. Mel blinked, waiting. Keanu said, I'm not a traditional Christian. I've wrestled with a lot of things, and I still do. He looked up, his voice steady. But Jesus is real to me. Not because of religion, but because in my darkest moments, he didn't give me answers. He gave me company. Mel closed his eyes briefly, absorbing it. "And that's what you gave us tonight," he said. "You didn't tell us how to believe. You showed us what love looks like." A few quiet sobs echoed from the back of the room. One producer discreetly dabbed her eyes with a sleeve. Another executive sat with his hand pressed to his heart. Nell sat back down slowly, but his spirit didn't shrink. If anything, it had opened. He glanced toward the back wall, then back to the circle of people, now entirely tuned into the unspoken shift in the room. "This industry teaches us to tell stories that move people," he continued. "But the story you just told, Keanu, that moved us. Not because it was perfect, but because it was true." A quiet murmur of agreement stirred across the room. Even those who had entered the screening with skepticism were now visibly moved, their walls lowered by the honesty that had unfolded. Keanu nodded, eyes still trained on Mel, his expression steady and humble. "I think truth is simpler than we make it," Keanu said. "I used to believe it had to be shouted or proven. Now I think truth is what stands when everything else falls apart." He exhaled slowly before continuing. "And love, the kind that doesn't try to fix, doesn't ask for proof, doesn't need applause, that's what I think Jesus embodied." Mel pressed his fingers to his lips, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if holding something delicate in his chest. One of the women seated near the aisle spoke for the first time. Her voice was gentle. "Keanu, thank you. You didn't just talk about Jesus, you let us meet him." There was no applause, no standing ovation, just silence and the unmistakable sense that something holy had passed through the room, not in a dramatic flash, but like the morning light warming a cold window pane. Mel's hand rested against his heart. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he looked up and spoke once more. For the first time in years, "I don't feel like I have to prove anything." He looked at Keanu with eyes filled with both awe and humility. "He reminded me that love can't be earned. It just is." Keanu smiled gently. "That's what saved me. Not a belief system, just that presence, that love." Mel leaned forward, his voice still quiet. "And I thought I invited you here to reflect on the film, but it turns out the film was just the doorway." Keanu nodded again. "Yeah," he said softly, "and tonight became something else." Mel's voice grew steadier but never lost its softness. "I've been chasing God through creation, through discipline, through rules. But tonight, I just sat down with him." A few more tears slipped down his cheek, and he didn't brush them away this time. The moment settled again like a blanket. It wasn't just that Mel had broken down. It was that in doing so, he found something he hadn't realized he lost. A faith not built on effort, but on presence. And Keanu, the man who had stayed quiet through so much of the night, had quietly led everyone there. Not by force, but by being willing to bleed in front of them. The room felt different now. It wasn't just a screening room. It was something more sacred. One producer whispered, "I don't think I'll ever look at faith the same again." Someone else added, "I came here to watch a film. I'm leaving with something I didn't know I needed." And through it all, Keanu simply sat there, still and open, his hands resting loosely in his lap, as if even he wasn't sure what had just happened, only that it was real. Real enough to change hearts, real enough to reach Mel Gibson's, and real enough to break the silence that had lived in each of them far too long. The air in the room remained charged with something quiet and holy. Not heavy, not loud, but undeniable. Mel leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling for a moment before speaking again. "I've spent years trying to capture God on camera," he said slowly, "trying to frame him, justify him, translate something infinite into 2 hours of film." He looked around, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. But maybe that was never the point. He turned to Keanu. "Tonight, I realized I don't want to prove God anymore." There was a pause. "I just want to witness him." The words struck the room like a soft echo. quiet but reverberating. Keanu tilted his head, visibly moved. He leaned forward slightly and responded with the same gentle conviction that had carried him all evening. Then maybe your next film isn't about God, maybe it's with him. Mel raised his eyebrows slightly, caught off guard by the simplicity of the idea. Keanu continued, I used to think storytelling was about control, about making sense of things, wrapping them up so they wouldn't haunt us. He gave a faint smile. But what if the story's job isn't to solve the pain, but to sit beside it? Mel let that settle. His shoulders dropped a little more, as if the burden of trying to explain the divine had finally been lifted. I don't want to make films that resolve anymore, he said. I want to make films that remain. Keanu nodded. Yeah. Mel turned to the others in the room, many of whom were longtime friends and collaborators. Think about it, he said. How many of our films wrap everything up in a bow? We tie the suffering to a lesson, the loss to a purpose. But maybe pain isn't supposed to be solved. Maybe it's supposed to be seen. Someone near the back whispered, That's what faith really is, isn't it? Mel smiled gently and continued, What if our job isn't to offer conclusions, but to create space for presence, for silence, for the ache that doesn't go away? Keanu leaned forward again. Make films from faith, he said softly, not about it. Mel looked at him, stunned by the clarity in that sentence. That's it, he said. That's it exactly. The room fell quiet again, not from discomfort, but because everyone was suddenly reevaluating everything they thought they knew about storytelling, about meaning, about their own work. A young screenwriter in the room, someone Mel had invited on a whim, spoke up hesitantly. Do you think there's an audience for that? For films that don't offer resolution? Keanu turned toward her and smiled. There's always an audience for truth, he said, especially when it's gentle, especially when it doesn't demand anything in return. Mel nodded, looking at her too. I used to think boldness was about pushing boundaries, he said, but maybe boldness is actually about letting people feel what they're too afraid to feel alone. Heads began nodding across the room. What was once a film screening had become a conversation about art, faith, and how both could coexist without either being reduced to propaganda or platitude. Mel's eyes lit up, not in a showman's way, but like a man whose old embers had just been reignited. He rubbed his palms together slowly and looked around the room as if seeing the people there for the first time. I want to create something that doesn't teach about God, he said, but something that lets people feel like he's with them, even in the ache, especially in the ache. Keanu leaned back and nodded quietly. He understood that desire, not to explain mystery, but to step into it with open hands. Most of the time, Keanu said, we're afraid to sit in questions. We think we need to rescue people from doubt. But the questions, those are sacred too. Someone from the production team, a man who hadn't spoken all evening, cleared his throat gently. What kind of film are you imagining now, Mel? He asked. Mel smiled thoughtfully. It wasn't the smile of a director plotting scenes. It was the smile of someone who had been humbled. I don't know, he said. And that's the beauty of it. For once, I don't have to know. I just have to listen. He paused, then added, maybe the next film doesn't tell you what to believe. Maybe it just stays with you, like a friend who doesn't walk away when you're grieving. Keanu looked down for a moment, then back up. That's what saved me, he said. Not a sermon, not a doctrine. Just the idea that someone stayed with me in the silence. Mel sat with that, the weight of it, the permission it offered. I want to write a story where the character doesn't win, where he doesn't find the answer, but where someone sits beside him anyway. The young screenwriter spoke again, her voice stronger now. I'd watch that film. I think a lot of us would. Others began to murmur in agreement. Some nodded silently. Some wiped away tears they hadn't expected. One of the older actors in the room, a man with decades of faith-based roles behind him, finally spoke. "We've spent years trying to make God cinematic," he said, "but tonight proved something. He's already present, in quiet words, in grief shared, in a man like Keanu showing up with his story." Mel turned to Keanu. "You know, I've had this idea stuck in my head for years. A man who loses everything, and instead of finding redemption through revenge or triumph, he finds it in the smallest thing. A stranger who just listens." Keanu smiled faintly. "That sounds familiar." The room laughed softly, the first moment of lightness in a long time. But then Mel added, "Maybe that stranger is never named. Maybe you only realize it was Jesus in the final scene, not because of what he says, but because of how he stayed." Silence again, a silence that held reverence. Keanu looked over, his voice low. "If you make that film, I'll be in it." Mel's eyes welled again, but this time with a different kind of tear. Not the sorrowful kind, the kind that comes when someone recognizes you, really sees you, and still says, "I'm with you." The idea of storytelling had changed for everyone in that room. No longer a tool to convert, persuade, or conquer, but a space to hold sacred things, to let people feel seen in their questions, not shamed. Mel's voice came one last time, soft and resolved. What would it look like to make a film that doesn't resolve pain, but honors it? No one answered, because that question in itself was the beginning of the next story. 6 months had passed since that quiet night in the Beverly Hills screening room, but its echoes had only grown louder. Hollywood, often obsessed with spectacle, was buzzing, not about explosions or box office numbers, but about a film that hadn't even been fully written yet. It started as a whisper, a rumor that Mel Gibson was working on something new, something deeply personal, unlike anything he had done before. People expected a sequel or a gritty historical epic, but the truth was stranger and far softer. The project was untitled at first. Internally, Mel simply called it Presence. No clear logline, no marketable plot, just the seed of an idea. A man grieving the loss of someone he loved, encountering a quiet presence that never offered answers, never fixed anything, just stayed. Industry insiders were baffled. Studio executives raised eyebrows. They wanted to know who the antagonist was, what the third act twist would be, how it would sell overseas. But Mel wasn't interested in explaining. He told them this wasn't a story to be explained, it was one to be experienced. The moment Keanu Reeves signed on, everything shifted. He didn't take a salary, he didn't ask for top billing. He told Mel, "This isn't about me," and that humility set the tone for the entire cast and crew. People who had worked on blockbuster franchises showed up asking for small roles, not for exposure, but because they felt something in the story, something raw and real. The film attracted actors who had never touched anything remotely spiritual. One actress, known for her edgy roles, read 3 pages of the script and said, "This is the first time I've seen grief written without a resolution. I'm in." Even the set felt different. There were no ego battles, no shouting. Scenes were shot in near silence. The cinematographer said it felt like painting light instead of capturing images. The composer built an entire score around a single note, one that never quite resolved. As post-production neared, Mel debated submitting it to festivals. He knew critics would be divided. He wasn't wrong. When the film finally premiered, it didn't generate headlines for shock value or political controversy. It wasn't described as bold or disruptive. Instead, the words used were quieter, gentle, thoughtful. Some reviewers didn't know what to make of it. One called it emotionally unresolved, not realizing that was the point. But ordinary viewers told a different story. The emails started first, then the letters, then entire online forums. People shared how they had lost a child, a parent, a spouse, and how the film helped them feel less alone. Not because it gave them hope, but because it gave them language for the silence they had carried. A man from Nebraska wrote, "I watched it with my daughter. We didn't speak for hours, we just sat there, holding each other." A young widow wrote, "I didn't know how to talk to God after my husband died, but that film let me know I didn't have to talk. I just had to sit, and He'd be there." Churches began hosting screenings, not as evangelism tools, but as spaces for grief. One small congregation in Arizona dimmed their lights and played the film on the wall, followed by 30 minutes of silence. No sermon, no altar call, just presence. In a podcast interview, Mel was asked if he considered the movie a Christian film. He paused, then replied, "It's not about Christianity. It's about Christ. There's a difference." That answer went viral. People who had walked away from religion began to revisit the idea of faith, not because they wanted answers, but because they wanted someone to sit with them in their unspoken questions. Film schools began using scenes from the movie in classes on emotional restraint and vulnerability. One professor remarked, "This is the first time I've seen a story where the climax is a tear, not an explosion." And through it all, Keanu remained in the background. He didn't attend red carpets. He didn't do a media tour. When asked to describe his role, he said only, "I played someone who was broken and found companionship in the silence." But it wasn't just the film. It was what happened after. Writers across Hollywood began pitching more stories that honored pain instead of resolving it. Small production companies were greenlighting scripts that didn't have clear heroes or villains, just people, real ones, carrying real things. A new kind of storytelling had begun to take root, faith-centered but not preachy, spiritually resonant but not manipulative, and at the center of it wasn't dogma, it was presence. In one quiet scene near the end of Mel's film, the main character sits at a grave in the rain. He doesn't speak. He doesn't pray. He just closes his eyes and breathes. That image stayed with viewers long after the credits rolled. It wasn't dramatic, but it was true. A woman in her 70s wrote to the studio, saying, "I lost my husband 40 years ago. I never remarried. I thought I was done feeling anything. But that graveyard scene gave me permission to feel again." In the months that followed, Mel found himself changed, not just as a filmmaker, but as a man. He spoke less, listened more. He stopped trying to convert people and started asking them what they carried. He admitted to friends that, for the first time in decades, he didn't feel like he had to earn love. It had simply arrived, quietly, the way it did in Keanu's story, and stayed. As for Keanu, he never claimed the story, never called it a testimony. He simply said in an interview months later, "Sometimes you don't need faith to begin, just enough pain to wonder if love is still possible." That quote ended up printed in journals, taped to hospital walls, and shared in recovery groups around the country. By the time the next award season rolled around, the film had already done what it was meant to do. It wasn't about trophies. It was about a shift. One that didn't shout, one that didn't argue, just one that walked into the room, sat with the broken, and stayed. The screening room where it all began no longer feels like just another luxurious space in Beverly Hills. People who were there that night describe it in hushed tones, as if something sacred had happened. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniably real. It wasn't just a film premiere. It became a threshold, a shift. Some attendees returned weeks later just to sit in the same seat where they had first heard Keanu speak, not because they were chasing celebrity, but because they were chasing something deeper. One lighting technician who had worked the event confessed to a friend that he sat in that room after hours just to cry. "I didn't even know why," he said, "but I finally felt safe to feel something again." A quiet reverence spread through small circles in the industry. Conversations once avoided became whispers of honesty. Writers known for sarcasm and edge began journaling about God, not to sell, but to understand. One director, famous for gritty thrillers, stepped away from his next project to spend time in silent retreat. In coffee shops tucked away from studio lots, small groups formed. Not Bible studies, not religious meetings, just people gathering to talk about what it meant to live without performance. Some called it Thursday nights. Others called it the Keanu Circle. There were no rules, just a question. How are you, really? The transformations weren't uniform, they weren't loud, but they were steady. Some left their churches not because they had lost faith, but because they had finally separated belief from shame. Others returned to sacred spaces after decades away, this time with no desire to be certain, only present. A prominent actress who had long hidden her spirituality finally said publicly, "I stopped needing religion to be right. I just needed God to be near." That quote was shared across countless feeds and framed on more than a few walls. The transformation reached beyond industry circles. A stuntman who had worked with Keanu years ago saw a clip from the film and quietly walked into a local chapel the next morning. He didn't pray, he just sat, for the first time in 20 years. And then there was Keanu. He didn't give speeches, he didn't write books, he didn't go on talk shows explaining his revelation. He simply kept showing up, at charity events, at bookstores, at memorials for people no one else remembered. He had always been quiet, but now his silence carried something different, kind of knowing. He didn't quote scripture, but when someone was grieving, he stayed with them longer than anyone else did. He didn't offer advice, just presence. When a young actor, overwhelmed with anxiety, reached out to him after hearing about the screening night, Keanu met him in a park. They walked for an hour, barely speaking. Before parting, Keanu said only, "Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." That young man told everyone he knew, not because Keanu gave him a solution, but because for the first time in his life, someone didn't try to fix him. Keanu had become what he once longed for, a witness to pain, not a savior from it. Mel Gibson, too, changed, but not in the way people might expect. He didn't renounce his past films or make grand gestures of apology. He didn't announce a spiritual awakening to the press. Instead, his edges softened. The man who once chased perfection through punishment began embracing imperfection as sacred. His team noticed the difference first. He stopped micromanaging. He asked more questions. He paused in meetings to ask how people were doing and waited for their answers. Not out of politeness, but because he genuinely wanted to know. He began walking to work instead of being chauffeured, not for health or publicity, just to feel the air, to breathe. 10 minutes later, he was still there. In one interview, months later, when asked what inspired his new tone as a filmmaker, Mel simply said, "A friend reminded me that love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays." He meant Keanu, though he never mentioned his name. At industry gatherings, Mel stayed later but didn't drink. He lingered with the quiet ones. When asked about faith, he no longer quoted doctrine or defended creeds. Instead, he shared stories. About failure, about grace, about the long journey of being human. And always, always, he returned to that night, that screening, that holy silence. Even those who didn't understand the full weight of what happened felt something shift. Agents started turning down exploitative scripts. Studios greenlit smaller, more thoughtful projects. Young directors were invited to speak about emotional truth, not just box office potential. Some called it a phase, a mood, a ripple. But for those who had been there, who had heard Keanu's voice tremble as he said, "Resurrection isn't erasing pain. It's walking through it and still standing," it was more than that. It was a new way of being. At a film school in New York, a professor played a bootleg audio clip from that night's conversation, not for religious analysis, but for its emotional depth. The class sat in silence. A few students cried. One stood up after the recording ended and whispered, "I want to make that kind of art." A veteran editor said it best at a quiet lunch in the Valley, "That screening didn't give me answers, it gave me permission. Permission to grieve honestly, to love imperfectly, to believe without certainty." Even outside the industry, in circles of ordinary life, the ripple spread. A nurse who watched the new Mel Gibson film wrote in an online forum, "For the first time, I didn't feel like a failure for not being okay." Another commenter replied, "Same. I didn't feel preached at, I felt seen." And so the quiet transformations continued. No revivals, no slogans, just people choosing to show up with more grace, less judgment, and an openness to mystery. Keanu remained a mystery himself. He never clarified his beliefs in interviews. When asked about that night, he simply said, "It wasn't about me, it was about all of us." Feeling less alone. Mel, on the other hand, found himself smiling more, not because he had figured it all out, but because he finally stopped trying. His life was no longer driven by fear or shame. It was shaped by presence, the kind that sits beside you when words run out. And in a town famous for noise, for illusion, and for needing to be seen, that presence became its own quiet revolution. 1 year later, Mel Gibson stood once again in the quiet screening room tucked inside the hills of Beverly Hills, the same room where a year earlier his most personal film had premiered. Not to critical acclaim or standing ovations, but to something deeper, a stillness that lingered long after the lights came up. He walked in slowly, holding a small thermos of coffee, though it had already gone cold. The room smelled the same, polished wood, old velvet, and a faint trace of cologne left behind by memories. The walls hadn't changed, but he had. Mel paused at the third row, Keanu's seat, the one where he had listened with such intensity, then broken the silence with words that shattered everything Mel thought he knew about faith, grief, and love. He reached out and touched the armrest gently. For a moment, he simply stood still. Then, without ceremony, he sat down, closed his eyes, and whispered a quiet prayer, not for clarity, not for courage, just for presence. For whatever had stirred in that room to stay alive, not just in memory, but in his heart. It was no longer about being right, it was about being open. The silence was not heavy, it was sacred. At the front of the room, the projection monitor blinked to life. Mel had asked for a clip to be queued up in advance, not for a crowd, just for this moment. The short sequence played from his upcoming project, a deeply intimate film, not about doctrine, not about heaven and hell, but about a man sitting beside his dying friend, doing nothing but holding his hand. No miracles, no resolutions, just sacred companionship. As the image flickered across the screen, Mel's breath caught. The lines were minimal, the silence intentional. The camera didn't cut away from the man's tears, nor from the friend's final smile. When the screen faded to black, the words appeared softly. "He didn't fix me. He stayed with me." Mel swallowed hard. Keanu's voice echoed in his mind, the same voice that had said those words a year ago. Back then, it had struck Mel like thunder. Now, it moved through him like rain. He sat in that darkness for a long while, letting the memory replay. Not just the words, but the faces in the room that night. The tears, the silence. The way Keanu hadn't tried to be profound, he had just been honest. And in that honesty, something sacred had awakened. Mel stood up slowly and walked toward the front. He wasn't rehearsing a speech. He wasn't mapping a script. He was stepping into something unknown but trusted. At the side of the projector, he opened his notebook. Inside were scribbles, verses, sketches, and a single sentence circled in red ink. We are not saved from the human condition, we are loved through it. He didn't know where the phrase had come from. Maybe something Keanu had said. Maybe something born from silence. But it had become the heartbeat of his next film. Not a film to convert, not a film to explain, but a film to accompany, to remind viewers they weren't alone. That even in silence, even in suffering, something divine could sit beside them, not removing the pain, but bearing witness to it. Mel closed the notebook and sat in the front row. For a long moment he stared at the empty seats, wondered how many people had come in here looking for stories and left with something more, something they couldn't name but couldn't forget. He wasn't a preacher, he wasn't a prophet, but maybe, just maybe, he could be a storyteller who honored what couldn't be solved. That was enough. In a whisper, he said aloud to the room, "Thank you." As he walked out, sunlight spilled through the narrow hallway. A few staff members nodded at him. He nodded back, but his mind was still inside that space. Keanu hadn't come to preach that night. He came to share, and in doing so, he gave permission for everyone else to put their masks down, to stop pretending they were fine, to let faith look like grief and love look like presence. Now Mel was carrying that moment forward, not as an artifact, but as a compass. Outside, in the crisp afternoon air, he paused before getting into his car. He looked up at the sky. It was quiet, not empty, just still. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he didn't need them. What he had was better. He had a story, a true one born from the aching voice of a man who had lost nearly everything, and found in that loss a companion who never left, a savior who didn't erase pain, who didn't demand perfection, but who stayed. So Mel whispered one last thing, a final line for his script, though he might never write it down. Presence is the miracle. Now it's your turn. Have you ever experienced a love that didn't try to fix you, but chose to stay anyway? Share your story in the comments and tell us, what should Keanu's next incredible journey be?